Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa. This week I'm talking with author Robert Jackson Bennett. Robert's debut novel Mr. Shivers came out in 2010 and won the Shirley Jackson Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Literature of Psychological Suspense, Horror, and the Dark Fantastic, as well as the British Fantasy Awards Sidney J. Bounds Newcomer Award. Most recently, he has released the first 2 of 3 entries in his Divine Cities trilogy, the first of which, City of Stairs, was released in 2014, and the second, City of Blades, just came out in January. These books are how I came to know his work, and he's become one of my favorite contemporary speculative fiction writers. Which, that reminds me, if you'll indulge me for just a second, I want to make a little request of you. I want you to think of a piece of art, whether it's a book or a photograph or a painting or a song, whatever, some piece of art that matters to you. And this could be something that you've loved for a long time, or it could be something that you just recently discovered. The important thing is that it resonates with you. If the person who created that piece is still alive, I'm asking you to just take a few minutes to get in touch with that person and tell them what their work means to you. And that could be a letter or an email or even just a tweet. But I want you to reach out and let that person know. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or lengthy. Just, I know from experience that making art can often be kind of a lonely exercise. You never really know if the work is landing or if you're just shouting into the wind. So when you do get some feedback, something to let you know that someone cares, it can be incredibly meaningful. And, I don't care how big and famous an artist gets. It always matters getting that connection. So whether it's someone just starting out or, I don't know, J.K. Rowling, just take a minute and let them know. You might not get a response back, but I promise you that it will make a difference, even in just a small way. Okay, so rant over. Back to Robert's books. Like I said, his most recent book, City of Blades, just came out in January, and I devoured it in about a week. It's really great, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone who enjoys contemporary fantasy. This one and the first in the series, City of Stairs. What's really interesting about this series is how it sort of defies categorization, blending tropes and styles from several different genres and subgenres, and what you end up with is something unlike anything I can recall seeing before. I'll put some links in the show notes to those books so you can check those out. And now, here's my conversation with Robert Jackson Bennett. So first thing, before I say anything else, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed City of Blades quite a bit.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly who it was that turned me on to your books. I've only read 2 of them so far, just the Divine Cities, both of them. But I'm really, one of the things that really struck me about the 2 of them is the way that you are doing kind of unexpected things with the genre, where they're a second world fantasy with an urban setting, and structured kind of like a noir, mystery thriller kind of story. And it's not something that you see a lot of.
Yeah, I'm finding that. I don't know. It was kind of weird because I'm talking to my film agent. She was asking me for lists of things that had inspired it. So I gave her, some names and things. Mm-hmm. And like things of like shows and films, it seemed similar to it. And I was like, well, I don't really know. Like, is there anything that like would come to mind for you as to what's kind of like what I've written here? And she was like, yeah, no, there's not much. And I was like, yeah, I feel like we're kind of in a weird place here where we can't be like, it's like this because there's not a lot that it's like. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit weird, and I think that there's I don't know, because like I don't consider myself at this point, having met people who are very well read in the genre, I can no longer claim to be that well read in the genre. So I don't know as much as I should about these kinds of things. It seems that way, and I'm gonna let you go ahead and say that because that's how it looks to me too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting time for for genre right now, especially for science fiction and fantasy, we seem to be in kind of an interesting time where, for a long time, this kind of fiction was sort of not really taken very seriously, even though there were people, I don't know, Octavia Butler or Gene Wolfe, who are doing things that are considered more literary in the genre.
Right.
But nowadays, I feel like sort of, I don't know, the past 15 years or so, people are really taking it a lot more seriously who wouldn't have before. Have you been finding that?
Yeah, I would think so generally. There, like there's pluses and there's minuses, because sometimes you'll hear about, some big controversy happening, like in the genre, and you like, oh man, let's go look at that, and you go and you look at it, and it's like kids in the schoolyard spitting on each other, and you're like, maybe we shouldn't be taken seriously. But
I don't know if that's any less true in the more literary genres.
Yeah,
either,
I was
though.
about to say the same kind of crap goes on in all the literary genres. I do think so in general that it is finding more of a purchase in the mainstream audience. I think a lot of that has to do with the internet, and there's a lot of effects that really cause that. I think Harry Potter, of course, was a huge one, which really built a system in which having a lot of backstory, highly evolved, like a mythos, and a very enthusiastic fan base. That is a really strong structure that I think a lot of people are trying to work with. And like those books, it's been 20 years since those came out.
Yeah,
and now they're all like all the people who read that have like all grown up, and so they are starting to take to read things that have the same sort of world building in them and the same sort of story, but they want to see more adult and more thoughtful things explored in them. And not to say that there aren't thoughtful and deep things explored in Harry Potter, but I think that you want to see people have like a bad breakup and doubt the meaning of life and things like that, because that's stuff that you're going to go through probably.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of strikes me, and this is something also noticing in your work, in these two books, that
first, like, just real quick, are we recording? This seems like recordable stuff.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, we are recording. All
Yes,
right, I just
we
want to make sure.
are.
I want to
Yeah.
show that. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, it strikes me that in these books, that this is, like you say, this is something that's changing a bit more recently. That in the past, maybe when I was a kid, especially people when not genre fans would look at it at science fiction and fantasy as something not really engaging with big ideas, or which has always struck me as very strange, considering that these speculative genres are all about ideas. But the way that the genres have developed more recently, that there's this sort of almost subversive quality to what people are doing with the genre, where people are able to use these structures to actually talk about stuff that might not have been expected before.
Well, I think the one thing that is tough is that genre, and sometimes this is a rightful criticism, gets criticized for being aesthetically conservative, and that the style that it's written in and the pacing and the structure, there are strong expectations as to how that's going to play out. And there have been books that I read that are science fiction and fantasy that feel less like books and more like action scripts. It's a series of action sequences. It can get kind of tricky, because I do think that genre fans struggle a lot when you do something that isn't that common like in genre. And to me, the present tense is not extraordinary at all. Like, I don't even think about it.
Mhm.
And I've read like lots of nonfiction, lots of like fiction of all sorts of genres that uses present tense. And I didn't get any criticism at all when I wrote my fourth book, which was American Elsewhere,
Mhm.
in present tense. And I wonder if it's because it's more of a literary book and that it's so weird, spacey, sort of like big, thick book of ideas thingy. And like no one ever said like I don't like this because it's in the present tense.
Mhm.
And that might have been because it wasn't as well read as Stairs and Blades are.
Mhm.
But when those came out, then suddenly there were a lot of people saying like I just am tired of these books written in present tense.
Mhm.
And it was like, just a little bit strange because to me that's nothing to even really think about that much.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder if we're learning to sort of push at the edges of what is acceptable in genre, where it's not so much structured like an epic or a thriller or a straight Bildungsroman. And so one thing that I really did want to write when I sat down with these books is that I wanted to write a story that was very adult, and that it's like about like adult fears, and it's about someone in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s, trying to deal with things that have happened to them. I didn't want to have it be a bunch of teens all excited and really anguished and things like that, because there's so many books like that out there.
Mhm.
And I really did want to look at it from the point of view from someone who's lived a lot of life and is trying to deal with it.
Mhm.
And I think that when you are like writing that style of story, it gets a little bit harder to make it a thriller.
Yeah.
Even though I do think, my books have explosions and fights and things like that on a mountaintop or whatever, and swords and guns going off, but the parts that I like the most are not those parts. It's when someone is alone in a room with maybe one or two people and is trying to deal with what I think of are really big problems.
Mhm.
And I do think of books as a conversation with itself or with the reader, in which the book tries to figure out what it thinks about one issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to pick big, heavy, hard issues that aren't going away, but also like I wanted to look at them from that sort of advanced perspective. I think this was something that was really missing, to have someone who has kids or even has grandkids and see what they think about what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, when you talk about the book being in communication with itself, with other people, when you're working in a genre, you're also necessarily in conversation with all of the other books in that genre.
Right.
And that gives you the opportunity to play with expectations in order to deliver ideas in a way that the way that you do it differently allows you to make those things stand out and become meaningful.
I guess. I think like I saw a review not too long ago where someone said that I was like a dark Pratchett, which was the best compliment that I've ever gotten.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think that my books have a lot in common with Pratchett. And Pratchett is one of those guys who I think that because he's funny and because he writes about fantasy, a lot of people don't take him that seriously or look at what he's doing that much.
Mm-hmm.
And not all of his books are even. Like, all of his books are strong. Some are a lot stronger than others, and some of them are a bit redundant, where he is looking at questions that he's asked before and is kind of like answering them in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
But even when he does that, it's still like leagues better than a lot of stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
And so I do kind of think of my books working like that, and that his books are almost like a philosophical like essay or experiment, where it says like, let's take this one idea and add this one like element that changes it or distorts it or accelerates it. Like, let's take the idea of a police force and then like introduce a gun. The first gun, and have the gun have a mind of its own. And that's really funny and intriguing, as you can see how that all plays out. So I do think of my books sort of like that, in that they are like as much as they are like thrillers or love stories or however much or whichever word you want to pick. I do see them sort of as experiments where there's a lot of like let's set up all the variables and put this into action and see how things unfold.
Yeah, and having it in that context of of a style of work or a genre where that people are used to certain conventions and maybe put in a certain frame of mind. When you talk about Terry Pratchett, like you say, a lot of people might not take him seriously because of the fact that his books are humorous, and they are very funny. And I think that's to the point where an unsophisticated reader can actually miss how sharp some of his insights are. But that when you do, like, you can engage with his books as pure, like, farce almost, but and then you'll, to the point where you it's almost like you're letting your guard down, and then because they're so funny or the genre is familiar, you've let your guard down as a reader, so that then when you do notice these little nuggets of insight, or in his case, the whole idea maybe that they hit you that much harder. It almost seems like.
Yeah, that was the phrase that I was about to say, was that it hits you harder because it gets inside your stance, your defenses, and it hits you right where you're least expecting it.
Yeah.
And I like, if I can do one or two books as good as he did it, then I'll be pretty satisfied with myself as a writer. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do. I love your books. I speaking of the kind of things that like when I remember one of the lines from City of Stairs that really stuck out at me. It was, I think, towards the end of the book where Shara says, she has a line where she says, I'm just paraphrasing, I'm going to get the wording wrong. She says, "I've never known privilege not to be utilized to its fullest extent."
Yep, that was actually her aunt who writes that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she says, it's got to be a really cold affair where privilege is not about who gets what, it's about who doesn't get what. And you have to be really thoughtful about who doesn't get privilege. And yeah, like that was, I think that came from something that I read where like someone had said like, let's like, just because we give someone like a privilege, it doesn't mean that they use it. And I was like, I don't think human nature works like that.
Yeah.
And so it just worked out really well, and I wanted to pop it in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do feel like those little bits in front of each of the chapters sometimes is cheating, because it's for the whole course of a book, I get to think up one good like line that I know isn't going to work in any dialogue that could still work in the chapter, and I could be like, all right, let's put it in the front here, and it feels pertinent, and it zings really good. And yeah, let's let it be, the little thing that happens like right in between all the chapters. Sure, why not?
Well, I mean, it provides a really interesting point of context, of sort of rounding out the way the reader can, because these ideas are in the rest of the story, but having them pulled out like that as a quotation at the front of the chapter can sort of provide a way of underlining it without seeming heavy-handed,
Right. Yeah, I think so. And I think so. One thing that I will say is that all good writers steal. I do think that they do. And what really had inspired me for that were two things. One was Orson Scott Card in Ender's Game, how he had the bits of each of the conversations between all the generals as part of each of the chapters, and it really upped the stakes and it gave you a sense of tension. But the other one was the game Thief, where right before each mission, you would get these little quotes from a book or like a scripture or something like that. And although it wouldn't be clear at all, like you would half understand what it meant, and that half understanding worked to provide an atmosphere for the rest of the level. And like I always thought that was a cool trick. And when the time came, I was like, all right, I'm gonna use that thing that I saw in a video game.
So, yeah. Now with these books, it's interesting. These are if I'm done my research right, these are your first sort of
secondary,
second world,
secondary world.
And I think another thing that certainly struck me and that that I've seen other people talking about is the way that you are, the way that you've sort of cast it, if that's the right word to use, that that you're taking, you've actually written about this. I remember I was just reading one of your blog posts recently, the Genre Fountain one, and you were talking about genre expectations and how, these things you expect everybody to be in a medieval European world, and you expect everybody to be white. But that's not what you've done with these stories. The main characters are, sort of
Southeast Asian.
Yeah, South Asian, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting in what you're explicitly dealing with colonialism and post-colonialism, but in a way where it's sort of turning both of those things, sort of inverting our world's history and then inverting it again almost. And I'm just sort of wondering what's been the reaction to that you've been getting?
It kind of runs the gamut. I think some people are like really impressed, but they're like, some are like, oh, thank you so much for having written this. And some people don't even notice it, and then some people, and like no one's really criticized it. I guess, and like I always kind of feel bad because the reason why I did it was just because doing something else seemed boring, and it wasn't because like I really wanted to try and strike like a balance in the genre, and like I'm not going to write this just because I want to have a book like this out there. It seemed like really boring to write like a book about a bunch of like white dudes in like a setting that looked like France or Germany from like the 900s. It just didn't seem that interesting to me. And like I've talked a bit about what inspired the story. Do you want me to go through that now about like where I had that idea and like why? Okay.
Yeah, why not?
So what had happened was I was at my house and I was cleaning, and that's usually when I get most of my really good ideas is when I'm cleaning. And I was vacuuming the house, and on the background there was we had turned on the TV, and it was to the Turner Classic Movie Channel, and we were watching Prisoner of Zenda. And it's about an Englishman who goes to a fictional country called Ruritania, Ruritania, I think. ANA maybe. It's very hard to pronounce because RUR is stupid. But so he goes there to this tiny little country, which is like in Eastern Europe, and like they all wear fur coats and they got the beards and these castles. It's very like late 19th century. And he happens to bear a remarkable resemblance to the king, and the king's brother, of course, sees this, and lots of hijinks ensue. And it was like kind of silly and quaint and funny. And I was just like thinking about how hard about like about what it must be like to live in this like highly balkanized little countries in Eastern Europe. And suddenly I thought, it'd be really hard to have to be there and be a diplomat. And I was like, oh, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's think about that some. And so I was like, all right, so there's like a diplomat going to these little tiny, like Eastern European countries that all hate each other and have this long history. And I thought, okay, but they also can't like her. And I had already made up my mind that the like ambassador should be a woman. But I thought to myself, okay, so why can't they like the like ambassador? And at first I thought, well, what is a culture that would clash really well with this one? It's very dour, very gray, very colorless, lots of pine and fog and elk and things like that. And so I thought a Southeast Asian woman would be really interesting, and have her be like highly educated, highly civilized, highly urban, and have her have to try and deal with these nuts in the woods. Mm-hmm. And then, I had to ask myself, but they have to hate her for some other reason, not just because of her culture, and not just because she's some like ambassador. And then I had the idea, it's because her country killed all of their gods. And that made me stop and think. And I remember I was like right where I was vacuuming when I had that idea. And I just thought on it, and I kept working at it, and then it turned into a City of Stairs. And I think that one reason why I did it, why I wanted to have something be like South Asian, lots of Indian names, was because when I was in high school, I grew up in Houston, and Houston is a highly diverse city. It's an oil city and lots of engineers from all over the world. And so in high school, like all my friends were Korean and Chinese and Indian and Pakistani or Saudi. And one big reason for that was because I grew up and I played in the orchestra. And the orchestra tends to be very diverse. And also I was just a huge nerd. And like if you look at the nerds in Houston in the 90s, the people who are on like academic decathlon, probably whites are going to be a minority. And so I was like the one white kid in my group of friends. And I left Houston to go to college in Austin. And Austin's very white. It has some Hispanics, not too many black people. And I went down to Houston recently to see my parents, and we went to the pool with my son, and I heard like 9 languages being spoken. And I remember just thinking like, wow, this is something that never happens where I live like anymore, and that kind of sucks. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of thought to myself, no one, like, why are we trying to mine Europe for fantasy stories? Because we don't really have anything in common with the Middle Ages in Europe, in Germany. Mm-hmm. Like, they're highly foreign to us. Why not have like actually like have people just as foreign to us, and like why not just look somewhere else for something new, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like it made sense to write stories about the people that I grew up with. And yeah, that was pretty much it. And like I can't claim that I really worked a lot of like Indian issues or like Asian issues into my stories, because I do think that my stories are still highly Western, and that it's about armies, and it's about capitalism, and it's about colonialism and things like that. Though those have had a large like impact on these areas, I still am a kid from the West, mm-hmm. and that's how I'm going to think about these things.
Yeah.
So as well as when you're writing a story about a country that was formed by gods, and one country that like overthrew all the gods, that kind of puts you in a really weird space, because most of history formed like from like the thousands on at the heart of a lot of conflicts has always been religion.
Hmm.
And if religion basically exists in a very strict format in your books, and for some people it doesn't exist, then it's very hard to bring in historical aspects that are accurate and feel authentic, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
So right away, I was thinking to myself, I really can't base this on any one culture too much because it lacks one of the biggest pillars of a culture in the world, like as we know it. It lacks a sense of faith. There's no need for faith in this, like in this world, because they were there, and some are still there, and now they're gone. And it's not so much faith; it's just knowledge. It's just fact. It was, yeah, and so that kind of was a hard thing to get around.
Yeah, but it's interesting too because, the way that you portray these different cultures, the Continentals and the Saipuris, there, that in a lot of ways, even though this is, really primarily going to be because it's written in English, I'm sure you're selling internationally, but it's really primarily going to be reaching a Western audience and particularly an American audience.
Right.
And yet the white people in the story are really the ones that feel more foreign.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. They're less capitalist, less mercantilist, less urban. They seem like the crazy ones compared to these people who are like, yeah, I really like having cars. I really like reading. Reading's fun. And sending telegrams and things like that. And yes, I wipe myself after I use the bathroom. And yeah, so it is a little bit fun to have that aspect in there. And like the first thing that I hear from friends and family who read these books, who don't normally read fantasy or read much, I guess you could say, is man, these names are hard. These names are really hard. Like, how do you make up these names? And I'm always like, well, I don't. These are actual names that I take from history and from like current things happening in India. Like, so one thing that I've found is if you want to find names that are like authentic but aren't strange, you just look up the parliament of one of the countries that you want to pull from. So I looked up the Indian parliament and like things happening in news like in India and took those actual names rather than try and make up something that sounded Indian, which is a great way to just shoot yourself right in the foot and sound like an idiot. As well as like when it came to for all of the Draylings, I looked up like the Swedish and Norwegian parliament, and man, they have a lot of like young people in parliament there, and like a lot more women, and both the men and the women are like surprisingly attractive, like to the point that I was getting kind of angry, like looking at the Swedish parliament. I was like, man, fuck you guys. Like I would watch politics a lot more if like they looked like H&M models.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was really funny is that on both sides, for the white people and for the Indian people, because for the Continentals, I pulled names from the Czech Republic and Poland and Russia, and all across the board, there were like I picked names that are easy. There are like real names that are very common that are much harder to read as an English like audience, and that's I think is very humbling when you like have to realize that just names alone are that there's so many names out there that to you are unpronounceable and strange, and yet to like other people they're as common as the day is long. And that was something that I really wanted to try and bring in these books to make sure that I used actual names from Earth, and just because as English readers and as like Americans, we know so little about all the countries across the world that we're like, yeah, it sounds like a space alien name.
Yeah,
and
it is interesting because it's like fantasy names are actually kind of a thing,
Yeah.
It's like, and that's another way that some of the things that you're doing here are playing off of sort of standard genre things. Like everybody, your standard fantasy reader is going to expect a lot of, Y's and apostrophes and extra consonants that aren't doing anything.
Yeah.
and this is playing off of it in a way where a lot of people, I mean, it's true, Americans can be sort of provincial in that way sometimes, but I think that we're becoming a lot more culturally literate in some of these ways. So a lot of us, especially readers of color, are gonna know that these are actual names, and seeing how that plays against your standard genre trope, it's an interesting juxtaposition.
I think that that's true. I think that there are some that are kind of catching on. It does feel kind of crappy, though, that only in a fantasy novel would certain readers have ever found these names and be like, I accept this. I will not contest this because it's in a fantasy book. I'm not going to be like, really think or like be like, I can't follow this. This is so complicated and hard. Though actually, one thing that's actually a bit funny was there is a very famous writer who I cannot name, who read Stairs and was saying about blurbing it, but was like, this first chapter, all these names. So, like, are these like space aliens? Is this like a science fiction novel, or is this like, like what is this? And I was like, I don't know how to respond to this. Like, this is a fantasy novel, yeah, and just because it has these names, it doesn't mean anything,
right?
And they're like, I don't know, and then we just never heard back from them.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a weird moment where I was like, dude, I mean, like, when you look at how they name elves in these stories, that's not that. I mean, like, that's crazy. That's just some made-up crap frequently. And then when I use, like, real names, suddenly it's like, so what is this? Is this, like, a fantasy? Is it, like, a space alien thing? It was weird. It threw me for a loop. And so that was when I was like, maybe I should have, maybe this was a terrible idea. Maybe I should have, used elves and trolls and things like that and, like, made up names instead of trying to make it more Earth-like oriented. But it seems to have worked out.
Yeah, I think so. You mentioned a bit ago that you were in the orchestra, and one of the things that I was surprising to me, reading up on you a little bit, was that you went to school to become a violinist?
A violist.
Okay. Yeah.
I was going to be a concert violist.
It's not really the expected career path for someone who trains that way.
Yeah. Well, they give out a lot of scholarships for that crap.
Well.
And, yeah.
I mean, do you find that anything that you got out of that training is applicable to what you do now? Is there any similarity?
Well, you got to learn to sit in a room alone and do something over and over again until it sounds good to you. And also be aware of how it's going to work with a bunch of other factors to know that at this point, they're soft, but they're soft enough for this part to be heard, or to be aware of, this is a clarinet scene, which is a very different tone and sound than other instruments, so you really need to play it like this. So there's that sort of sense of you have to be really, like, aware of what's happening. So there's that. That was very helpful. And as well as learning that, each piece is not just notes on a page. Each piece expresses a moment in time in the mindset of the composer. And that was one of the things that, was one of the reasons why I think I left, was that when in most classical music, you are, unless you are a composer, which is incredibly difficult, you are always expressing someone else's work. And that just kind of got boring. As well as when I realized, there was good for high school, but good for high school and good for college are two different things. And I suddenly had to realize how more committed I would have to be to playing and learning and getting better. And I was like, nope, I'm not going to do that. And it was actually very striking because I had been playing since I was 8 or 9, and I was pretty good for the high school arena. And I think everybody just assumed that I was going to grow up and become this thing. And I was like, well, if everyone's going to assume this, I guess I got to do it. And it was just because I felt sort of obliged to do it. My parents had spent a lot of money on lessons. People had traveled to see me play in certain concerts, and yada yada yada. And I was like, well, I guess since everyone's watching me, I guess I'll do this. That was I think the big reason was I guess because everyone's looking at me, I might as well have to do this because the crowd voted. And then once I got there and the crowd wasn't there and it was just me alone in college, having to play, I was like, this actually doesn't make me very happy. Just and that was something else, which was, you know, there is a big difference between being talented at something and being good at it. Like a talent is like an innate like ability to do one thing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that you like it. Like there are people that I know who can do something really well, and they could make a whole career out of it if they wanted to, but they don't actually like to do that thing. And so I think that the phrase that came to mind a lot was just because you've got a big dick, it doesn't mean that you've got to be a porn star. I don't know if I would apply that quite to how good I was at music. I wouldn't say that I had a big dick in music. But like there were things that I could do that just came to me very easily. And but at the same time, like that wasn't that interesting to me. And I didn't love it as much as to make me want to like wake up at 6 a.m. and practice for 4 hours. Mm-hmm. Every day. And one of the things that they said once I got to college was, well, you're going to have to basically relearn how to play the viola because as what you're doing right now is not right. And I was like, oh, well, shit. And like I've never really looked back. Like there's a lot of people that I have heard that have said, like if only I like kept playing the piano, I'd love to sit down and just play the piano right now. Like for me, I'm like, there's a lot more fun things that I'm doing right now, in writing and reading and thinking and saying stupid things online.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, it is a little bit satisfying to know that I've been there and know that I've done something and to have found out that it's just not for me.
Yeah. I think when most people are talking about that kind of thing, I mean, certainly when I say, I wish I had stayed with my violin lessons when I was in first grade or whatever, that it's really less about making it than it is about just the regret of something not done.
Yeah.
Whereas, with you, it doesn't seem like that would be a particular regret. It'd be more like, gee, I wish I had, if you hadn't become a writer, that would have maybe been the thing that you would have been wishing.
Yeah.
But,
I think so.
So you mentioned the saying dumb stuff on the internet. I don't know if I could get away with not talking about this, about your Twitter account. That you're completely hilarious on Twitter. I actually tell people sometimes that like you and Sam Sykes and Mike Cole are like probably the three thing, like you guys and Clickhole are like the only reason I want to be on the internet ever.
That's pretty sad.
Well,
no, but yeah, like I get it. It's just us as we make jokes at each other. And what kind of sucks is that at some point in time we started like a big text chain, and now we text each other stuff now rather than tweet it. But to a certain extent, maybe that was a great idea because some of the stuff that we text is like just completely out of line. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's one of that for a long time that was one of my favorite things to do, and I think I got kind of with the Mike and the Sam thing, I totally got sucked into that by Sam, and I remember that for one morning, like I woke up and it was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and Sam was already harassing Mike and just like tweeting him like quotes from Zardoz, and I was like, what the hell? And I was like, this is what you do when you wake up in the morning, like I haven't even peed yet, and you're already going at him. But I think like sometime around 2013 or 2012 or so was when I was like, and it was when people were still trying to figure out how to promote themselves on social media, really. That's kind of what it felt like. 2010 to 2012 was when people were like, hey, social media is a thing. Maybe we can sell stuff. And I was still not doing too good as a writer. And I tried being, like, I'm going to say thoughtful, intelligent things online. And I was like, well, that didn't work. So why not just say all the stupid crap that comes in my brain all the time and that I don't have a choice about, and just keep doing that? Because I mean, it's not like that's going to hurt anything at this point. And I think it became really at first kind of popular among writers because they were like, "Look at this idiot." And it's only been in the past year or two that I've gotten more like non-writers, like fans, like being like, like looking at the things I've tweeted. And I've like tried to actually kind of back off on some of the more really profane things. But it's really hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's a lot of fun. And like one thing, I forget who said this, but like a really good way to learn how to write is just to write all the time. Like it doesn't matter what you're writing or who it's for or what it's about. But if you're putting words on the page or on something for anything, then it's working out it like a muscle that will be useful when you need to sit down and write the things that you really want to write.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of how I think about it, is that when I tweet, I'm learning how to craft a really good line that does all the stuff that I want to do in 140 characters.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's played out a little bit in my books because I do feel like I'm getting a lot of good lines in these that I don't think I got in the Troop maybe, or in The Company Man, where I'm like, there's some real zingers in here. And I wonder if it's just because I've been tweeting so much that I've learned how to, try and do as much as I can with words rather than spend a whole paragraph talking about, I don't know, moonlight, to get to the damn point.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's a good thing. I don't know.
Well, it's entertaining, at least.
Yeah,
One of the
at least
things
entertaining.
that is, striking to me is that, I'm not a novelist, certainly. I write and I take photographs, and it's one of these things where I'll go to a workshop or something, and it'll be about marketing your art, like how to market your art, and how to connect to your audience, that kind of thing. And the standard wisdom is generally that you should be on message, or at least you should be trying to project a certain image that, this is what you want to attract for the people that are going to find your work, and connect with your work. And, there are in your books, there are definitely humorous lines. There are lines in there that are really funny, especially once you have a little bit of context into, I don't know if this was intended to be funny, but the line about trigger discipline in City of Blades was,
Yeah.
it certainly made me chuckle. But your books are not they're not comedic books in general, and so probably people coming to your books first and then to your Twitter, or even the other way around, might find that kind of surprising.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well my Twitter account is at selling books or giving people an impression of what my books are about. Every once in a while, I'll talk about I'll go on like a tweet rant about something kind of serious. But yeah, my books are pretty serious and they deal with pretty heavy stuff. They deal with death and country and forgiveness and acceptance and the afterlife and a bunch of other stuff that's tough to work a chuckle out of.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons why I tweet the way I do is A, because I like it, and B, it's it's fun to do. But also, there's this idea that by using social media, we'll understand the writer, and by understanding the writer, we'll understand the writer's works. And I don't think that that's true. I think that if you know me, it's not going to add anything to my books for you. I think that the primary relationship for reading is with the writer and the text. Is with the reader and the text, and the writer shouldn't have a whole lot to do with it. So when it comes to someone being let's follow Robert Jackson Bennett online and learn exactly what went into these novels, and I'm just like, piss. That gives me a lot of delight to have them open up my Twitter feed and just shut their computer and throw it out the window. That gives me a lot of pleasure. And every once in a while, I'll have someone say, "I bought your books because this was funny," and and I'm like, "Wow, you have terrible judgment." But yeah, there's there's that's my Twitter account. I don't know. I was trying to make a point out of it, but I was like, it's there. People are looking at it. I don't know why.
We should probably switch gears. The For the second segment, you talk about generational differences. So I wondered if you could sort of get us started off on that.
Sure. I mean, like one of the things that I think that my books have done is that I really want to look at change and change between cultures and change over time. And one of the things that I think is different about the Divine Cities is that when you're done with the trilogy, you've read 20 years of history.
Mm-hmm.
You get to see him get old, get gray, have successives, have like failures, have kids, and lose people. And I really wanted to look and see exactly how societies change and how they don't change, and how sometimes change happens in big, big jumps, and sometimes change happens in small, grueling battles. And that's something that I think that we're seeing right now in the political debates that are happening right now, where it's this idea of how are we going to handle change? Are we going to try and do one big push and just try and shove it all through? Are we going to like knife fight in the trenches and take each little inch as we get it? How do we want to go about this? Or how are we going to fight it? How are we going to bring things back to what we wanted? And so on and so forth. And it's just really striking to me that the difference between me and my dad is probably much larger than the difference between him and his dad. But the difference between me and my kid is going to be even bigger than that, because of how society and culture and technology has changed everything. In like 30 years, it's going to be like I wonder, like, is it going to be really hard for me to talk to my son and to talk about the things that he believes in and things that he values because of how things have changed so much? And, like, I think sometimes about why my generation is a lot different than the preceding one is so different, not a lot different. And one of the things that I think is that, my generation moved around a lot more than any other one. Like, we moved, I think, 4 or 5 times as a kid. And my dad changed jobs a lot. And I think that was because, for one reason, a corporate layoff became a thing, whereas before it wasn't nearly as much of a thing, as well as job transfers and things like that. And finally, this was something that you could actually do now. You could actually move across the country within a month and have it be something that you do every 5 to 10 years or so. Suddenly that was like something that was very common in a society, and not so much like this weird outlier that you never saw before. Something that was just oil, or for the military. That was basically like the 2 industries that you saw people move a lot. And then suddenly it wasn't. It was what a lot of people did. And I think also one reason why I think that we're so different is that religion is just so much less of a factor in our lives. And I think that might be for a lot of reasons. I think that it's tough to nail it down. But I think that because we have so much more access to perspectives and viewpoints now, that there's a lot more competition for your brain space. And it's no longer just taken for granted that the church that's right down the street that you've always been to is necessarily going to be right. Now there's a real marketplace of ideas going on, and not everyone is finding a church to be the place that they want to go to with those ideas. And I think that part that might also have something to do with how much we move now, because back when I was a kid, the church was the tent pole of the very small town that I grew up in. It was where you went to do everything. That was like school and church were the two things that you did where you saw everyone that you knew. And nowadays, since we're so much more in flux, we've become decentralized. There's no more common ground that we see all of our friends and neighbors that we work with. We don't have that at all, really. And I think that sucks, that we don't have a marketplace where we come together and see each other as we do our shopping, or as we go and take our kids to soccer practice. We don't really have a place where we meet and talk with our peers. It's a lot harder to make friends as an adult, I think, than it was a couple of years ago. And they had this piece, actually, it was on Vox, I think, that was really quite interesting, about how the American suburbs are set up, so it's very hard to actually make friends because you're behind walls, and it's just a place where you kind of hang out, but you don't really walk across the street to talk to your neighbors that often. And they said, one reason why you have such strong friendships in college is that you have to live with one another. You have to share space a lot. And because of that, because you're all on top of each other, you get to know one another and find that you like one another sometimes. And then you keep that going for a long time sometimes. So I found that really interesting. And I think that the way that we use space right now, where it's all very separate and it's all very decentralized and it's all in flux, has its pluses and its minuses. And I think we're still trying to find out exactly how it's changed how we live our lives. That was a lot. That would make my uncle proud.
It's interesting because just to sort of touch on some of the stuff that you said, I'm not 100% sure that geographic mobility is something that is a bigger factor than it was before, particularly because my understanding is that geographic mobility is something that is very tied to wealth and class, that people with less wealth tend to be less geographically mobile.
Yeah.
But then also, definitely you saw huge migrations happening in the 30s, and even actually in the post-war era in the 50s. There was a big thing starting from the Depression, but really going well into the 60s, where you would see the sort of increasing urbanization of the United States is one of the big trends in sociological trends in the U.S. history.
Right.
I think maybe one of the things that might have caused the thing that you're talking about, where people aren't as connected to their geographic communities, may have more to do with urbanization and smaller towns being fewer people living in smaller towns. Having that may have something, because when I grew up, I also grew up in a pretty small town, and we all knew all of our neighbors. I live in San Diego now, 1.3 million people here now, and I sort of know my neighbors just by sight, but we're not friends. I don't really know them.
That's how it seems to be, where you know them by sight, but you don't actually know them.
Mm-hmm.
If they could move and you'd be like, oh, all right, and you just go back to watching TV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I have found that as I've, I have 3 kids. The oldest is 7, so he's in 2nd grade now.
Wow.
I have noticed that as we've gotten more involved with his school, that has been a big place where we've started to gain more of a connection with this community. We've lived here now 10 years, 11 years, and this is really the point at which that we have actually started feeling like we're putting down roots.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I'm looking forward to a lot of school. And I think that some of it might have been, my family's from the South, from the deep South. And a lot of them who were born there, even the ones who are now 40 or so, they're still there. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of interesting that there's it seems like, I don't know if the South just has an older way of doing things, but the escape velocity for the South is much higher than it seems to be in most regions. And I think that's because it's less urban, because it has less connections to like other places. Like it's very hard to fly into the town where my family, one of the towns where my mom's side is from heavily, and where a lot of her family lived, like going back generations, is Winfield, which is in the northern part of Louisiana. And flying into Winfield is nigh impossible. You got to go to Shreveport, which does not have a very active airport. So getting there and then getting over there, it's a pretty big pain in the ass, as well as like driving there, because you have to drive through these like little like 2-lane highways that go through these giant pine forests. And my wife was like, "This is a horror movie. What we're in right now. This is a horror movie. Like something's gonna happen. There's gonna be something in the woods. Yada yada yada. They find our bones." And so, like, I do wonder if it's that sort of aspect, because maybe it's just because the South is in an older place, perhaps by choice. You know, they've always had the chance to modernize, and they never really took it. Though Atlanta and South Carolina are two ones that seem to have had a lot more flux. So I don't know. Mm-hmm. But like when I talk to my parents, and like I talk about how they grew up, it just sounds so more centralized. Like they could go to a place and do things. And for us, like for me and my brother, we lived in like the suburbs of West Houston, where like driving to go do something was like a big pain in the butt. It was a lot easier just to stay around the house from 4 p.m. until you went to sleep. Like it was very hard to go to a store because you had to have a car, and the stores are, you know, like usually kind of far away because you're in the suburbs. So it's like miles and miles of homes until you got to a place where you could buy stuff. And so it does feel like me and my brother and a lot of our generation has been trapped in air-conditioned rooms for most of our formative years. And like I'd hear of friends who would like have parties, and I'd be like, "Where?" And they'd be like, "At our houses." And I was like, "At your house? That's insane!" And it would like blow my mind. And it just sounded so surreal, because like living in the suburbs of West Houston was like living in a world where all the corners of the walls were sanded down to like nice, round, smooth. You couldn't hurt yourself on those. It was very hard to do something dangerous in the suburbs of West Houston. It felt a little bit like The Village from The Prisoner, where it was made for you. We've done studies, and this is what you like. And you're like, I guess I like these fountains, sure. And it's kind of interesting when you read about how the suburbs were found. Like one reason why they had all these twisty, windy cul-de-sacs is because they wanted it to be hard to drive into the suburbs. It was not meant to be a place that you could drive through. It was meant to keep out people who didn't know exactly where they were going. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of times where I think some of the first suburbs were put next to places where a lot of people were low income, a lot of people of color, and they were like, well, how are we going to keep them out? And then they thought, well, let's make it just an actual maze, and make sure that there's no real kind of a gathering point where they can get through. I think there was something on 99% Invisible, which is a great podcast, and they had a piece about, I think it might have been the cul-de-sac. I can't recall, about the history of the cul-de-sac, and that was meant to be something that was very removed. Mm-hmm. It was very hard to access. It was really interesting, but you know, at the same time, you've basically put yourself in a prison. Yeah,
I remember seeing a thing the other few months ago that was showing different city layouts and how suburbs were really developed with cars in mind. And that was very, that if you were on foot, then you would want to be able to take direct paths to places and to be able to access public transportation. That the cul-de-sac layout of the typical suburb really forces you to have cars, which in turn forces you to be of a certain,
Yeah.
wealth strata.
Yeah. You have money if you want to have a car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting, when you talk, you mentioned, people our age. I'm about, I think, 4 or 5 years older than you are, but so, fairly contemporaneous. Being different from our parents' generation, but also even more different from our kids' generation. I'd be interested to see how that plays out, because I think that's a very natural fear for, especially once you have kids. I'm not necessarily sure it could go that way. I'm not completely convinced that it will. One of the things that I think is the most interesting is, I think, when people talk about technological, mediation in our relationships these days, is that they will look at millennials and at the children of millennials and say these people are not connected. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, these are people who are spending most of their time interacting with other people. I think there's a
Yeah.
very, innate human desire for connection.
Yeah. Like, one of the things that is really interesting is some of the great relationships of like the 18th century and the 19th century was on paper,
Mm-hmm.
as dudes wrote to each other and had like these long letters that went back and forth. Like, I think that Jane Austen's best like novel, Persuasion, which is like, for me, that's my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's all about like letter writing. And you do have to wonder, like, how different is that from texting and tweeting and Facebook stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, we just found a way to do it kind of better.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's, that aspect of it that really gets like overlooked, because from me, you're just sitting on your phone looking at your phone and not paying attention to me, and I'm like, why don't you get a chance to like really talk to people? And like, you could be like chatting with your aunt who's having health issues,
Mm-hmm.
or like being like, here's my essay on Rembrandt,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm having to make you put that down to talk to my dumb ass about whatever's going, like, that squirrel is very big and I wanted to talk to you about the big squirrel, and instead you're reading about Kant,
Mm-hmm.
like a jerk. But
Everyone who reads about Kant is a jerk, for
yeah,
certain.
that's true. Yeah. But yeah, like, I do think, and I guess part of it is because like and like, I don't want to get too political here, but like, my dad's generation fundamentally sees the world as very different from ours,
Mm-hmm.
from mine at least, and it's very difficult for me sometimes to talk to him about stuff. And I think that there's an unspoken like agreement between us, where it's like, we're not actually going to talk about stuff that matters, and it's like, no, we sure aren't.
Yeah.
So yeah, here we are, and it's just very odd. And like, I do wonder at times, like, because I've grown up with like TV shouting things at me and my phone shouting things at me and my computer shouting things at me, that I've like built up an immune system to this crap, where like, I'm aware of when it's shouting at me, and like I know when to be like, I don't trust this, or I can like this and know that it's not true at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But for a whole generation of people, my wife used to do a charity work where she would go to basically a government living a complex, and take very old people there to go and get their groceries. And this one old man was blind, and but would watch the news all day. He would just have it on. He could see some things, but he couldn't see that well. He couldn't drive. And anyway, he basically just sat and watched Fox News all day for like 8 or 9 hours. And I wonder if, because I have grown up with like knowing news to not always be fair or be like real, that I have a system in my brain to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he doesn't. because you would have thought that his reality and like our reality were two wildly different things.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot with my dad and his generation when I like try and talk to him about things like climate change or whatever, that there's just these enormous barriers that have been put there by other systems of like media. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an odd experience.
Yeah. I think, when you talk about the internet particularly, and when you talk about the difference in perspective between, people our age and people the generation older than us, that it's one of the things I think, I've been thinking about this a lot actually lately. One of the things I think has really changed in the internet age is that we have a lot more access to a lot more kinds of viewpoints that we didn't before. And I think one of the things that Fox News particularly feeds on is that if you grew up only surrounded by people like you, which,
A lot of people did.
a lot of people did, then having someone come to you and sort of stroke that exact little node brings
It's comforting.
It's very comforting, and it makes the other things that they're saying it makes them feel more valid, perhaps. And I think a lot of the turmoil that we're having right now has to do with the fact that, especially because of things like the internet, sort of leveling the playing field to some degree. I guess it's arguable how large a degree, but that there are more kinds of voices and more, just so much more information that you wouldn't necessarily have seen before, and you're seeing people connecting with, particularly in the last few years, and in maybe 4 years, other people's narratives becoming more commonplace and more familiar.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's true. I like to think that because the internet has kind of made it more of an equal playing field, where the modes of like information aren't held by, 6 people, and instead we are all now sort of like a publisher or a contributor to the media. I think that's changed a lot, like especially with things like Black Lives Matter, as well as like they had this thing. It was a while back that was really interesting about how people were accessing the internet and like Twitter and Facebook, and because now it's on our phones, suddenly a whole new cross-section of people who otherwise wouldn't own a computer or have the time to do this now can do this because it's something that sits in their pockets. And it's really quite interesting. But they also had this thing that I read recently about, it was an essay, a Twitter essay, I think is what it was, but they had compiled it into a whole essay about how the internet has like made it so that our party system now acts as hosts for third-party candidates, and that Trump and Sanders are both really third-party candidates. Like Trump is really not a Republican, and Sanders for a long time didn't think himself to be a Democrat, and might not act in a lot of ways like an establishment a Democrat would. But because of the way that we've changed our media, they suddenly can have a lot of success. They can say, I'm going to run within this like framework that you've set up, but I'm going to play by completely different rules. I'm going to, like with Sanders, he's just had such massive support from young people. And Trump has just owned all the media on like cable as well as on Twitter and things like that. He's just completely outplayed everybody. So it's really interesting where you start to realize that as these things, as these new modes come into play, that there's less need to play by old rules, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is a really great place to wrap up. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Sure, absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to City of Miracles. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It'll be out next year.
Great. Well, I will look forward to that. Okay, so that was my conversation with Robert Jackson Bennett. His new book, City of Blades, is available wherever books are sold, and if you'd like to follow him on Twitter, which I highly recommend, you can find him at Robert J. Bennett. If you've got some thoughts about Robert's work or anything we talked about, please drop me a line at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can also find me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at Keep the Channel Open. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. That really does help other people find the show. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next week, our guest will be painter and fellow podcaster Jeffrey Sidoris. And if I could just make one more small little plea, it's primary season in many states right now. Please go out and vote. It's really important. Just go do it. Go vote. Okay, that's all. And remember, keep the channel open.